Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us once again as we continue to study the book of Ephesians. Today we continue with Paul's letter, and we're in chapter 2, verse 11 to verse 22. Now in this letter, which is explosive, which is direct, one would say Paul has taken the bull by the horns. In this letter, Paul goes straight to the nuts and bolts of what you find in many churches or in many groups of people. It is a negative thing, and this thing is called name calling. Now, as Paul starts off the part of that letter, he says that now to you, the Gentiles who are called the uncircumcised, by those who call themselves the circumcised. Now, what Paul is saying is already touching on a sensitive issue, an explosive issue that Paul goes straight into. Now, this issue was causing divisions in the church at Ephesus, and Paul starts by addressing that issue. Now, as you go to that portion of the letter, one thing that you learn is that Paul uses contrasts to bring out his lesson. He talks about Gentiles and Jews. He talks about far and near. He talks about circumcised and uncircumcised. He talks about enmity and peace. He talks about destroying a wall and building up a temple. He talks about without God and with God. So Paul uses this method to bring his point home. Now back to the issue of circumcision that Paul talks about. What was happening at the church at Ephesus was that the Jews were saying Gentiles need to be circumcised for them to be accepted into the fellowship of the believers. And the Gentiles were saying we don't need to be circumcised. So there was a rift. There were now two groups. There were now two opinions, two positions in the church at Ephesus. Now to address this point, Paul starts by reminding the Gentiles that you were once not a people. You were once a people without hope, without God in their lives. You were once a people who were far from God. You did not have rights to the covenant, to the promise. He's reminding them about who they are, where they came from. He's reminding them about their past. Is it important that sometimes people are reminded of their past? I think it is. It is important that you as an individual, you also reflect and remember where you came from. This helps in trying to address, to assist people, to treat people fairly, to be considerate, to have a heart that understands what someone is going through if you remember where you came from. Some Christians act as if they fell from heaven and they just came down as angels and they never sinned. And when they relate to people, they are too harsh and too hard and too vindictive and too condemning of other Christians. And Paul says, remember you Gentiles, remember where you came from. So he uses that method to remind the Gentiles of where they came from. But as he goes with his issue, he touches on the issue of circumcision. Now to the Jews, this was a hot potato. To the Jews, this was a deep message. This was something that was given to their father Abraham by God himself. The act of circumcision actually had verses to support it. It had practices to support it. It had illustrations. I'm talking about Moses, who was going to Egypt to rescue the children of Israel. While on his way, he had not circumcised his sons, and God got angry, and he was about to kill Moses. And what did Zipporah do? Now, Moses' wife Zipporah actually took upon herself the responsibility of circumcising the boys, or else Moses was going to die. That's how serious the act of circumcision was. I'm not going to talk about how Abraham and God had this done in a ceremonial covenant-making service where God literally placed himself and said, he will do as he has promised. Now, this was all the circumcision promise, and the Jews took it seriously. Now, for Paul to come at this time and say that circumcision is nothing, it was a blow on the children of Israel, on the Jews. Now, what did Paul say? Paul said that Jesus Christ came and destroyed the wall that was separating the Jews and the Gentiles. He destroyed that wall. What wall was this? Remember that when Christ was on the cross, it was said that there was an earthquake. And it was about the time of the evening sacrifice. And the high priest was in the temple doing his job. He had his knife in his hand and the sheep on the altar. And he was preparing to sacrifice the evening sacrifice, was preparing to kill the evening sacrifice. And when he was about to do that, it is said that the temple, there was a curtain that separated the holy place from the most holy place. That curtain is said to have torn from the top right down in the middle, and it exposed the most holy place, which the high priest alone visited once a year. And the sheep that was about to be sacrificed escaped. Now, that is the wall that was brought down by Christ. That wall, that curtain, represented all the processes and procedures and ceremonies that took place pointing to Christ. And these things included circumcision. And Paul said, this wall of circumcision, for example, was brought down by Christ at that point. Now my question will be, don't you have things, statements, religious positions that you hold on to simply because your only justification is that it's written in the Bible? But so is circumcision. Don't you have certain positions that you hold dearly to and they are very important to you because you've got an experience that you had because of this position, just like Moses had, just like Abraham had? There are some things in the Bible that God has moved a step further with, but sometimes we hold back on them. We refuse to move with God. We choose to remain in the past, holding on to the things that happened in the past, and yet God has moved on. Now that is what was happening in this situation. God had moved on, but the Israelites, the Jews, chose to keep holding dearly to the rite of circumcision. Now, our lesson takes a twist now. It now talks about these walls that we build, these walls that we erect to try and keep other people outside so that we can keep ourselves inside. Now, what walls are those? Now, today, we will try and look at only 1, 2, maybe 3. It's a really interesting topic. You will see why. Now, the walls that I would want to talk about is maybe culture. Let's start with culture. Cultural walls. Do we build cultural walls to try and keep other people's culture out of Christianity? Do we do that? Well, when I was thinking about it, I thought of the practice of ululating, mururu, pururudza. That practice is 100% based in Africa, parts of Asia, and parts of India. And it's little to unknown in the rest of the world. Now, ululating in our culture happens, look at a graduation ceremony. When a child is graduating, you have people ululating. When a person is getting married, you have people ululating. They are rejoicing that a makoti or son-in-law or has come into the family. There is ululation. But when it happens that it is a baptismal ceremony and a child has chosen Christ, suddenly one cannot ululate. Why? Because it is said that if one ululates, it is unchristian. It's unholy. Are these just not cultural differences? I mean, I accept that that people of my darker color are louder, are more boisterous. They are more, they enjoy using their vocal cords a little bit more. Now, does that affect one's relationship with Christ in any way? Is that not a wall of culture that we build? This is just but one example. Now, you would see all these things in music and things like that, where people transfer one culture to another, and then they make it a requirement that unless you adopt and accept my culture, you cannot be a part of my Christ or of my church. Now, we need to understand the difference. Now, rushing onto this topic about culture, I then asked myself, now, does it mean that a person who worships in a South African church cannot worship with a person maybe from European setup? Well, for one, I think because of language barrier, it's impossible for people who speak different languages to come and try and worship freely, comfortably, using their individual languages. It becomes chaotic. There will be noise. So definitely, it's more practical for people who share a language to worship together. Is that building a wall? I don't think so. I don't think it's an intentional purpose to keep other people out. What about situations where all right, let's not go further. Let's talk about institutional walls. Could it be that we're building walls within our institutions so that we put policies, we put procedures that allow certain people, certain types of people, or certain races, or certain, levels of people to occupy certain positions? Is it coincidence that certain positions are occupied by people of a certain color, are occupied by people of a certain creed, are occupied by people of a certain nationality? Is it coincidence, or are these walls? Now, I wonder if Paul was to come and to write to the church in 2023, what names would he use to identify the classes, the walls that we've built? Now, these are examples of how we've built walls in our institutions to retain certain positions. We've built walls in our churches, to keep certain people out or to only have them in only as they accept a certain culture. And Paul would say this is wrong. Paul would clearly say that's wrong. Now, the last bone I would want to talk about culture, which I'm sure can be debated later, is on the issue of women in leadership. Now, while thinking about it, when Paul said that the wall that separated the Jews and the Gentiles was destroyed, the question that raised in my mind was, so who went and crossed over to the other side? So the Jews are inside, the wall goes down, and the Gentiles are running into the church, so to speak. Now, who was running in? Was it the males only, or it was the male and the female? Was it men only, or it was men and women running into the temple? Was the wall brought down for men only, or the wall was brought down for men and women? Obviously, the wall was brought down for men and women simply because Paul says in another passage, there is no bond or free, there's no Jew or Gentile, there's no male or female. We are all one in Christ. Now, if you go further, then the question is, now, whenever people talk about women in leadership, why does the word priest or Levite come up? What relevance is it? Because the wall came down, and when the Gentiles got into the church, there was no priest, there was no Levite. They were all one. So was this oneness allowed for a specific gender and not for another gender? But anyway, that's a discussion for another day. But these are areas where, just like in Paul's time, even in our time, you've got people with different positions. Now, how does Paul solve the challenge at Ephesus? He says that Christ came and he took the circumcised, the Jew, and he took the uncircumcised, the Gentile, and he took them and he formed one thing. He formed his temple, and now he's building his temple using these two nationalities or tribes or groups of people. He's taking the differences with these people and he's forming one thing. And he's saying these two have become one. And these two are now building one temple. They have become one. Now the lesson is talking about us being at one with each other, having peace amongst ourselves as brethren, as members of clergy, as members of a church. Are we one? Paul is saying we ought to be one.